New York City, 1931. The streets hum with jazz and bootleg whiskey. Neon lights flicker across rain-slicked pavements, where gangsters in pinstripe suits vanish into smoke-filled speakeasies. Behind those glowing doors, fortunes are made and lives are snuffed out with a whisper. It's the twilight of prohibition, an era built on greed, fear, and ambition. And somewhere in this labyrinth of vice stands a man who sees what no one else does: the chaos of crime could be organized. The mafia could be tamed. The underworld could have a government. His name is Charles Lucky Luciano, and he's about to turn America into his chessboard. To understand Luciano is to understand the duality of America itself, the land of dreams and the land of hustlers. Born into poverty, forged in brutality, and gifted with a mind sharper than any blade, he is not a man of emotion, but of structure. Every decision he makes is a calculated move, every alliance a long game. While other mobsters rule through fear, Luciano rules through reason. He doesn't just want power, he wants permanence. And that ambition will not only crown him as the architect of the American Mafia, it will also damn him. The camera moves through the smoky backrooms of New York's underbelly: Italian mobsters, Jewish bootleggers, Irish enforcers, all clawing for a piece of the American dream. Politicians are bought like cheap cigars, cops drink with killers, and the city becomes a living organism of corruption. Every borough tells a story of survival, every handshake hides a dagger. Yet within that chaos, one man's vision begins to take form, a network that runs like a machine, where every crime family becomes a cog serving a greater purpose. Luciano doesn't see himself as a thug, he sees himself as an engineer of power. He studies people the way others study maps. He knows who's loyal, who's weak, and who can be bought. His mind works like a ledger, every risk measured, every betrayal anticipated. He doesn't need to shout to command respect. His silence is strategy. In a world ruled by fists, Luciano uses patience as his weapon. When others kill to prove dominance, he waits to inherit the throne. That's what makes him dangerous, not his violence, but his vision. Meanwhile, America itself is changing. The Great Depression has turned desperation into opportunity. The moral lines blur as men who once worked in factories now work in smuggling rings. The demand for illegal liquor, gambling, and women creates an economy of sin that thrives beneath the surface. For every honest man losing his home, there's another finding wealth in corruption. And Luciano understands better than anyone that morality is just another luxury the poor can't afford. The sound of jazz fades into sirens. A murder in Little Italy. Another gang war on the docks. Newspapers call it organized crime, but in truth, it's anything but organized. Old world bosses cling to their traditions, running neighborhoods like feudal lords. They speak of honor, but act out of pride. Luciano watches them, the so-called mustache Petes, with disdain. To him, they're relics. Men obsessed with respect instead of results. He knows that if the mafia is to survive in modern America, it must evolve. It must shed its Sicilian skin and become something new, something corporate, structured, untouchable. As the rain falls over Manhattan, Luciano walks through Times Square, not as a tourist, but as a strategist surveying his kingdom in waiting. The lights of the Paramount Theater reflect in his eyes. To others, it's just a city. To him, it's a chessboard, every borough a battlefield, every player a piece waiting to be moved. He knows his enemies are watching, but he also knows they don't understand the game he's playing. The mafia, to them, is blood and loyalty. To him, it's business. The voiceover slows, deepening, history will remember him as a criminal. But to his world, he was a visionary. The screen cuts between archival flashes, bodies on sidewalks, cops raiding warehouses, politicians shaking hands with devils. Luciano stands in the middle of it all, untouched, unreadable. In the chaos of 1930s New York, where every man scrambles for survival, one figure moves with purpose. The age of brute force is ending. The age of intellect, manipulation, and power through structure is beginning. And at its center stands Lucky Luciano, calm, calculating, and ready to rewrite the rules of crime forever. His rise will not be a story of chance. It will be the story of strategy. The birth of an empire built not on loyalty, but on logic. The world doesn't know it yet, but a revolution is already unfolding in the shadows. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was no place for the faint-hearted. At the turn of the 20th century, it was a world of noise, sweat, and survival. The streets were narrow, choked with the smell of garbage and coal smoke. Tenement buildings leaned against one another like exhausted boxers after a long fight. Every corner spoke a different language: Yiddish, Italian, Polish, Irish, and every child who grew up here knew that the city wasn't built for them. It was built on them. In those crowded alleys, a young boy named Salvatore Lucania, later known as Charles Lucky Luciano, began to understand the rules of a brutal game long before he ever had the power to play it. He was born in 1897 in Lercora, Sicily, a village haunted by poverty and controlled by the whispers of the mafia. His father, Antonio, worked in a sulfur mine, breaking his body for pennies. His mother, Rosalia, dreamed of a better life for her children, a dream that pushed them to board a ship to America when Salvatore was just 9 years old. But when they arrived in New York, the promise of a new beginning turned out to be another kind of prison, one made of noise, hunger, and humiliation. The Luciano family lived in a cramped tenement on East 10th Street, surrounded by immigrants who all shared the same illusion, that America was the land of opportunity. For most, it was the land of survival. The young Luciano learned quickly that kindness didn't feed you, and honesty didn't pay rent. School bored him, the streets educated him faster. He watched the older boys run errands for gangsters, flashing money and power like trophies. He wanted that. Not the poverty, not the begging, not the endless scraping by. He wanted control, to never depend on anyone again. That hunger became his compass. While other boys dreamed of becoming firemen or musicians, Luciano dreamed of command. He didn't want to be part of the crowd, he wanted to own the street they walked on. By his teenage years, he was already known in the neighborhood as a sharp dresser with sharper instincts. He ran errands for local thugs, protected younger kids from bullies, for a price, and learned how to make people owe him favors. Even at 15, Luciano understood something most men never did: debt was power. A favor owed was a leash invisible to the eye but strong enough to pull any man by the throat when the time came. It was this psychology of control that would later define his empire. But power always had competition. The streets were filled with boys like him, desperate, clever, ruthless. Irish gangs ruled some corners, Jewish gangs ruled others, and the Italians fought to carve out their own slice of the city. Luciano didn't fight them head-on, he studied them. He realized early that alliances mattered more than blood. He'd work with anyone who could help him rise: race, religion, tradition, none of it mattered to him. Where others saw enemies, he saw assets. That mindset, so rare, so pragmatic, would become the blueprint for the American Mafia itself. Around this time, he met two boys who would change his life forever: Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. Lansky was quiet, analytical, a Jewish kid with a mind built for numbers. Siegel was fire, reckless, violent, pure chaos wrapped in charm. Together, they were a paradox: intellect, aggression, and ambition fused into one unstoppable force. They didn't see themselves as gangsters, they saw themselves as entrepreneurs of the forbidden. Together, they built the early foundations of a criminal partnership that would later become legendary. Luciano's early years were a crash course in survival and psychology. He learned when to fight and when to wait, when to bribe and when to threaten. He learned that fear was a currency and respect was a commodity. By his early 20s, he wasn't just another street kid, he was a businessman in a world that didn't yet recognize crime as business. He invested in speakeasies, ran protection rackets, and built a reputation for reliability, a rare trait in an underworld where betrayal was tradition. But beneath his calm exterior, Luciano carried something darker, the memory of humiliation. The insults hurled at Italian immigrants, the way the police treated his father, the look of hopelessness on his mother's face when rent was due. He wasn't just climbing for wealth, he was climbing to erase shame. Every dollar he earned, every rival he crushed, was another step away from the poverty that had defined his childhood. Power wasn't just about control, it was revenge against a world that had made him small. As the 1920s roared to life, the city itself began to transform. Jazz clubs replaced quiet taverns, and prohibition turned ordinary men into millionaires overnight. Booze flowed through back doors, and the underworld became an economy of its own. Luciano saw it coming. He knew that prohibition wasn't a moral crusade, it was a business opportunity wrapped in hypocrisy. America wanted to drink, and he was going to make sure it could. By the time he turned 30, Charles Lucky Luciano had already built a network of connections across every ethnic line in New York. He could move between Italian crime bosses and Jewish financiers with ease. He didn't believe in loyalty, he believed in efficiency. He didn't follow orders, he gave them. Yet what made him truly dangerous wasn't his ambition, but his restraint. He waited for the right moment, knowing that one bold move too early could end everything. In the chaos of immigrant New York, where every street corner was a battleground, Luciano rose not through violence, but through understanding. He understood people, systems, and above all, the value of patience. His childhood had taught him one lesson that would define his empire: in a world built on hunger, the man who can wait to eat will always win. By the early 1910s, Charles Lucky Luciano had already begun climbing the rungs of New York's criminal ladder. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest kid on the block, but he was the smartest, and in a world where fists ruled the streets, intelligence was a weapon few understood. The Lower East Side was his classroom, and every alleyway was a lesson in strategy. By day, he watched how small-time operators collected protection money. By night, he studied how neighborhood bosses managed loyalty through fear. He wasn't just learning crime, he was learning the architecture of power. As a teenager, Luciano started running small rackets with precision and charisma. He collected nickels from kids for safe passage to school, offered protection to street vendors, and charged gamblers for peace of mind. It wasn't the money that mattered, it was the control. He learned early that dominance wasn't about who had the most muscle, it was about who could make others depend on him. His influence grew because he was dependable, not erratic. While other thugs ruled through chaos, Luciano ruled through predictability. That reliability became his brand, a kind of street professionalism that even older criminals noticed. His partnership with Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel evolved from childhood mischief into organized enterprise. They weren't content with nickel-and-dime hustles, they wanted scale. Luciano handled diplomacy and structure, Lansky handled finances, and Siegel enforced the rules with his characteristic violence. Together, they represented the future, a multicultural syndicate that broke every ethnic boundary in organized crime. To the old-world gangsters, it was blasphemy. To Luciano, it was genius. The streets had taught him one universal truth: money didn't care about race. As Prohibition began in 1920, the American underworld exploded with opportunity. When the government made alcohol illegal, they unknowingly created a market worth billions. Luciano recognized the gold rush before anyone else did. He built connections with bootleggers, truck drivers, and corrupt dockworkers, creating distribution lines that fed the thirst of New York's high society. Politicians, judges, cops, all drank from the same supply he controlled. It was a new kind of empire, one that blurred the line between criminal and businessman. But success always brought danger. Luciano's first major lesson in survival came in 1929, a moment that would change his face and his destiny forever. One night, he was kidnapped by a group of rival gangsters, beaten nearly to death, and left on a Staten Island beach. His face was slashed with a knife, his body bruised beyond recognition. No one ever confirmed who ordered the hit, though whispers pointed to jealous rivals in the underworld. Miraculously, Luciano survived. When asked how he lived, he simply smirked and said, "I'm just lucky." From that day forward, the nickname stuck, Lucky Luciano. But to those who truly understood him, it wasn't luck that saved him. It was calculation, instinct, and the refusal to die before his empire was built. The attack changed him. The swagger remained, but beneath it grew a colder, sharper edge. Luciano began to view violence not as chaos, but as management, a tool for maintaining order. He started to structure his operations like a corporation, dividing responsibilities and delegating power. He created small cells, each handling different rackets: gambling, liquor, protection, narcotics. If one cell fell, the others survived. It was a structure inspired by efficiency, not fear. For the first time in American criminal history, a gangster was thinking like a CEO. He also learned to master the art of invisibility. Luciano didn't crave fame, he craved control. He dressed impeccably, spoke softly, and avoided public attention. He let others make noise while he made moves. When the newspapers glorified figures like Al Capone, Luciano quietly studied their downfall. Capone's arrogance, his public image, his flaunted wealth, they were mistakes Luciano swore he'd never repeat. He understood that real power didn't shout. It whispered. By his mid-20s, Luciano had earned a reputation as the bridge between old-world mobsters and the new generation. The Sicilian traditionalists, known as the Mustache Petes, believed in bloodline and loyalty to Sicily. Luciano saw them as obsolete. They clung to rituals, superstition, and old grudges. He, on the other hand, envisioned a global enterprise. He didn't care where a man came from, as long as he could make money and keep quiet. This ideological divide would soon become the fault line on which the mafia would either evolve or die. Luciano's charm masked his ruthlessness. He could sit at a table, share wine with a man, and have him killed the next morning if it served the larger plan. To him, sentimentality was weakness. The mafia wasn't about honor, it was about efficiency. But unlike many gangsters, he didn't kill for pleasure, he killed for necessity. Every life taken was a problem solved, another piece moved off the board. That detached logic made him both respected and feared. The partnerships Luciano forged with Lansky and Siegel expanded into a network that touched every borough. They established speakeasies that catered to New York's elite, bribed police precincts to look the other way, and used violence strategically, never recklessly. Lansky balanced the books with mathematical precision, Siegel handled logistics and intimidation, and Luciano served as the conductor of it all. Their empire was invisible to the public eye, yet it pulsed beneath every nightclub and dockyard in Manhattan. Beyond the money, Luciano developed something far more powerful: vision. He understood that the chaos of gang wars was unsustainable. The constant killings between Italian factions weakened everyone. The Irish and Jewish gangs, meanwhile, were consolidating their power, working smarter, not harder. Luciano wanted to do the same for the Italians. He dreamed of uniting the crime families into one body, a governing system where disputes were settled like boardroom negotiations, not bloodbaths. It was a radical idea, a mafia without constant murder. He began meeting quietly with ambitious younger mobsters who shared his views, men like Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese. Together, they whispered about the future, a world where power wasn't inherited through bloodlines but earned through skill. Luciano knew that to make this vision real, the old order would have to fall. The Mustache Petes, with their codes and pride, stood in the way of progress. And soon, he would remove them the way he always did, quietly, strategically, and completely. By the dawn of the 1930s, Lucky Luciano was no longer a street kid or a hustler. He was the architect of a new kind of criminal empire, rational, efficient, modern. His mind, forged in the poverty of the Lower East Side, had become the most dangerous weapon in New York. He had built the foundation. Now he was ready to build the empire. The early 1930s were a time when New York City looked like it was burning from within, not from fire, but from ambition. Beneath the glitter of the Jazz Age, blood soaked the cobblestones. The streets echoed with the gunfire of rival mobs fighting for dominance, their names whispered in fear across Little Italy and beyond. Every night, another body turned up in an alley, another deal went wrong, another empire rose and fell in the time it took to pour a glass of whiskey. In the middle of this storm stood Lucky Luciano, calm, methodical, watching chaos unfold like a general studying the battlefield before striking. The Italian underworld was split in two camps, the old guard and the modernists. On one side were the mustache Petes, traditional Sicilian bosses who clung to ancient codes and mistrusted outsiders. They believed the mafia belonged only to Sicilians, that business should stay within the bloodline, and that power was maintained through fear and ritual. On the other side were the young Turks, men like Luciano, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, and Albert Anastasia, ambitious, pragmatic, and hungry for modernization. They saw the mafia not as a brotherhood, but as a business. To them, loyalty wasn't about heritage, it was about results. The city was divided, but the tension had a face, two powerful bosses, Joe, the boss, Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano. Both claimed to be the true head of the American mafia. Masuria represented the old-school Sicilian way, superstitious, paranoid, and brutally controlling. Maranzano, recently arrived from Sicily, styled himself as a Caesar of crime, draping his commands in Roman metaphors and rituals. Between them, a war erupted, the Castellamarese War, a bloody conflict that turned New York into a killing field. Luciano, though allied with Masuria at first, saw the war as a disaster. Dozens of men were dying over pride and tradition, while the police and media closed in on the underworld. He understood something neither Masuria nor Maranzano could grasp: chaos was bad for business. Every day the war dragged on, money bled away, shipments were disrupted, and trust evaporated. Luciano began to think not as a soldier, but as a reformer, someone who would end this war not through loyalty, but through logic. He played both sides carefully, keeping communication open with Maranzano's people while maintaining a facade of loyalty to Masuria. To the old boss, Luciano appeared obedient, respectful, quiet, dependable. But beneath that mask, he was already plotting the endgame. He knew that if the mafia was to survive and thrive, the old men had to die. The only question was who would go first. In April 1931, Luciano made his move. He invited Joe Masuria to lunch at Nuova Villa Tomorrow, a Coney Island restaurant known for its pasta and privacy. They played cards, shared wine, and laughed like old friends. Then Luciano excused himself to the restroom. Moments later, gunmen entered the room, men Luciano had handpicked: Vito Genovese, Bugsy Siegel, Albert Anastasia, and Joe Adonis. The silence of the restaurant was broken by a burst of gunfire. When the smoke cleared, Masuria lay dead, cards scattered on the table, a pistol still in his hand. Luciano had just eliminated his boss, and in doing so, ended one chapter of mafia history. But he wasn't finished. With Masuria gone, Luciano threw his support behind Maranzano, recognizing him as the new boss of all bosses. For a brief time, peace returned to New York. Maranzano reorganized the mafia into 5 families, establishing boundaries and structures that still exist today. On the surface, it looked like progress. Yet behind the scenes, Maranzano's ego grew dangerous. He fancied himself a Roman emperor, demanding tributes and enforcing loyalty through spies and assassins. He saw Luciano's intelligence as both an asset and a threat. Within months, he began plotting Luciano's death, unaware that Luciano was already planning his own. Luciano understood that no empire could survive under a single dictator. Centralized power created resentment, fear, and instability. The mafia needed something else, a system that distributed power, reduced bloodshed, and kept business running smoothly. He envisioned a commission, a board of directors for organized crime, where each family had a voice and no single man could claim absolute control. But to create this system, the last obstacle, Maranzano, had to be removed. In September 1931, Luciano struck again. He sent a team of assassins to Maranzano's office in Manhattan, disguised as IRS agents. They entered the building calmly, flashed badges, and within moments, drew guns. The shots were quick and clinical. Maranzano fell to the floor, stabbed and shot to death in his own headquarters. The Roman Caesar of crime had been dethroned by a man who saw himself not as a king, but as an architect. With Maranzano's death, the Castellamarese War ended. The streets that had run red for years finally fell silent. The old world mafia, built on pride, heritage, and superstition, was gone. In its place rose something colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous, the modern American mafia, governed by profit and efficiency. Luciano had done what no man before him could, he brought order to anarchy. But his revolution came at a cost. The murders of Masuria and Maranzano made him both powerful and vulnerable. Everyone in the underworld knew who had orchestrated it, but no one dared speak his name. In one stroke, Luciano had reshaped the entire criminal landscape of America. He was not merely the head of a family, he was the designer of an institution. Still, even in triumph, Luciano understood the fragility of power. He had won through intellect, not bullets. The same brilliance that lifted him up could one day be his undoing. As he stood at the top of Manhattan's skyline, gazing over the city that now bent to his will, he must have felt the weight of it all, not the fear of being killed, but the fear of becoming the very kind of ruler he had just destroyed. For now, though, the city belonged to him. The gangs that once fought each other now paid tribute under a new banner. The Commission, his brainchild, was already forming in his mind, a democratic underworld that would run like a corporation, invisible yet omnipotent. The war was over. The empire was beginning. Lucky Luciano, the street kid from Sicily, had just unified the American mafia. He didn't just win a war, he rewrote the rules of it. The year was 1931, and for the first time in decades, New York's criminal underworld was quiet. The smoke from the Castellamarese War had cleared, and the city's crime families, bloodied, suspicious, and exhausted, waited for someone to tell them what came next. In the vacuum left behind by dead bosses and crumbling loyalties, one man emerged not through brute force, but through vision. Lucky Luciano had done the impossible, he had ended the chaos. But now came the harder part, keeping the peace. To do that, he needed something stronger than fear. He needed a system. Luciano understood that raw violence could build empires, but only structure could sustain them. The Sicilian mafia of the old world had relied on the code of omerta, a sacred vow of silence and loyalty that transcended death itself. It was a moral universe in which betrayal was worse than murder, and silence was the highest form of honor. But in America, that code had begun to crack under the weight of greed and modernization. The old bosses used omerta as a shield to preserve their personal power. Luciano wanted to use it as a foundation to build something far larger. For him, omerta wasn't just a rule, it was psychology. It was how you controlled men who couldn't be ruled by law. He redefined it, reshaping ancient Sicilian tradition into an American philosophy of discipline. Every man in his organization, from the lowest runner to the highest captain, understood that words could kill faster than bullets. Silence wasn't superstition, it was survival. To talk was to die, and not just you, but your family, your friends, your entire legacy. Luciano weaponized fear into loyalty. But his innovation wasn't only in fear, it was in structure. He transformed the mafia into something resembling a corporate enterprise. Every family became its own autonomous business unit, led by a boss, underboss, consigliere, and capos. Each controlled their soldiers and rackets, paying a percentage of profits up the chain. The five families, Luciano, Genovese, Mangano, Gagliano, and Prophesai, operated under one unified vision, profit before pride. Disputes were no longer settled by vendettas, but by negotiation through what Luciano called the Commission, the Mafia's governing council. The Commission was his masterstroke. It was the end of dictators and the beginning of a boardroom of criminals. Each boss had an equal vote, and no man could declare himself the boss of all bosses. If one family overstepped, the others intervened. To the outside world, it looked like chaos had ended. To those inside, it was the birth of a republic, a criminal democracy designed to outlive any single leader. Luciano had turned the Mafia from a tribal war zone into an empire that functioned like the U.S. government itself, complete with checks, balances, and consequences. Under this new system, the Code of Omerta became the glue that held everything together. It wasn't just silence about crimes, it was silence about the structure itself. Outsiders, even other gangsters, were kept in the dark about who made which decisions. Information flowed upward, never sideways. That secrecy protected everyone, from street-level extortionists to the highest-ranking bosses. Luciano enforced it ruthlessly. Men who broke Omerta vanished quietly, their names erased as if they never existed. The brilliance of Luciano's method was that it replaced loyalty with dependency. Every man owed his livelihood, his safety, and his future to the organization. A soldier's family was provided for, his debts could be paid, his enemies could be handled. But if he betrayed the code, he didn't just lose his life, he lost the protection that made him someone. Omerta was not only silence, it was belonging. Still, Luciano knew that rules alone couldn't hold men together. The Mafia was an ecosystem of ambition, envy, and greed. So he combined old-world ceremony with new-world pragmatism. Every made man took an oath in blood, pledging allegiance to his family and to the Commission. The ceremony was sacred, theatrical, and psychological, designed to make the initiate believe he was part of something divine. In truth, it was a calculated manipulation of loyalty. The ritual wasn't about faith, it was about control. Yet behind the illusion of order, there was always tension. Some bosses resented Luciano's influence. They saw the Commission as a way for him to keep an invisible hand on everyone's business. Others feared that cooperation would make them weak, that without blood feuds, respect would fade. But Luciano's strategy was simple: make everyone richer, and they'll stop asking questions. He centralized certain rackets like narcotics and gambling under shared ownership, ensuring that no family could grow too independent. Every decision funneled power back to him, even as he claimed to be just one voice among equals. The Code of Omerta didn't only protect the Mafia from police, it protected it from itself. It replaced open violence with covert influence. Murders became rarer but cleaner, carried out with surgical precision when necessary. Luciano even established informal rules for killing: no assassinations without Commission approval, no hits on law enforcement, no unnecessary bloodshed. To the outside world, it seemed like the Mafia had vanished into thin air. In reality, it had simply become invisible. In smoky backrooms and dimly lit clubs, Luciano's lieutenants enforced this new discipline. They kept ledgers, laundered profits through unions, and bribed judges with envelopes of cash. The Mafia no longer looked like a gang, it looked like a corporation with its own hierarchy, HR system, and enforcement policy. Every man had a role, every role had a purpose. And all of it ran under the unspoken thread of Omerta. But there was also something almost philosophical about Luciano's code. He had turned an ancient idea, silence as honor, into a tool of modern governance. In his mind, Omerta wasn't evil, it was order. It was what kept society from tearing itself apart. Everyone breaks the law, he once said, we just admit it. To Luciano, the Mafia was simply a reflection of the world, cleaner, more honest in its corruption. Politicians lied, businessmen cheated, police took bribes, he just created a system where the lies were efficient and the rules were clear. By the mid-1930s, his empire was running like clockwork. The Commission met quietly to resolve disputes, the money flowed steadily through unions and casinos, and the city's most powerful figures, from police chiefs to senators, took their share without question. The old mafia was dead, replaced by an institution that would endure for generations. And at the heart of it all was a single, unbreakable law: speak, and you die. Luciano had built his empire on silence, secrecy, and structure. He had turned chaos into control, violence into strategy, and crime into an institution. But deep down, even he knew that systems built on fear could only hold for so long. Omerta might keep the peace, but it could never kill ambition. The code that protected him today might one day become the weapon that destroyed him. For now, though, Lucky Luciano had achieved something no one thought possible: he had made the mafia rational. And for a brief, golden moment, New York's underworld looked less like a battlefield and more like an empire governed by men who understood the rules of power. By 1932, the machine Lucky Luciano had designed was in motion, sleek, invisible, and unstoppable. From the outside, it looked like New York had finally quieted down after years of bloody turf wars. But underneath the calm, an empire was pulsing with precision. Luciano had turned organized crime into a fully functioning business empire, and his innovation wasn't just in violence or hierarchy, it was in understanding that vice was America's most profitable commodity. Gambling, liquor, narcotics, prostitution, labor unions, everything the law condemned, Luciano turned into revenue. Where others saw sin, he saw opportunity. He was no longer just a gangster, he was an administrator. Every operation, every territory, every man in his organization was part of a system. He enforced discipline not through threats, but through structure. Each of the 5 families operated like branches of a corporation, paying dues to the commission, obeying rules, and sharing profits in exchange for peace. The profits were staggering. Bootlegging alone was making millions every year, and with prohibition still in effect, the public's thirst for liquor showed no sign of slowing down. But what made Luciano different from every gangster before him was how he diversified his empire. While other mob bosses focused on one trade, Luciano built a portfolio. He moved into gambling dens, horse racing, speakeasies, and labor racketeering. He bought influence within unions, particularly the dockworkers and trucking unions, ensuring that everything moving in and out of New York Harbor passed through his control. Goods, liquor, cash, even drugs, nothing flowed through the city without his blessing. The mafia wasn't just controlling the streets anymore, it was controlling commerce. To the working class, Luciano's empire was invisible. Ships came in, cargo moved, factories ran, and behind it all, envelopes of money changed hands in backrooms. It was a system built on quiet corruption. Cops were paid to look the other way, politicians received campaign donations disguised as favors, and judges found reasons to dismiss cases. Luciano didn't need to threaten anyone, he simply made everyone an accomplice. Corruption became a business relationship, not a crime. But perhaps his most profitable innovation came from something as old as human desire: prostitution. Luciano and his close associate, Tommy "Three-Finger Brown" Lucchese, organized the city's scattered brothels into a single, centralized operation. Instead of streetwalkers and independent madams, there was now a structured network run like a corporation. Pimps became managers, prostitutes became employees, and every dollar passed through Luciano's organization before it hit the streets. It wasn't just crime, it was logistics. At its peak, the prostitution racket alone made hundreds of thousands of dollars a month, untaxed, untraceable, unstoppable. Luciano also expanded into gambling, understanding that it wasn't just a pastime, it was a psychological addiction that guaranteed endless profit. He set up underground casinos, rigged horse races, and took over numbers games in Harlem. The bets flowed from factory workers to millionaires, all feeding the same machine. "Give the people what they want," he once said, "and they'll pay you to break the law for them." That was his genius, not inventing crime, but organizing it into an economy. The mafia's influence reached beyond the streets. Through Frank Costello, Luciano built bridges with the political elite. Costello had a gift for charm and conversation, and together they developed what became known as the policy of cooperation. Instead of fighting the government, they infiltrated it. Mayors, police commissioners, even senators, all became part of Luciano's extended network. The lines between criminal and official blurred until they were indistinguishable. New York's skyline glittered with respectability, but behind every shining window was a handshake with the underworld. This new order created a sense of sophistication that the mafia had never known. Luciano began to see himself less as a criminal and more as an industrialist. He dressed like a banker, carried himself like a diplomat, and operated like a CEO. He was punctual, methodical, and surprisingly restrained. He banned unnecessary killings, encouraged negotiation, and punished recklessness. His organization had accountants, lawyers, and clerks, men who might have been businessmen in another life. To outsiders, it was crime; to Luciano, it was capitalism stripped of pretense. The commission meetings reflected this new professionalism. Held in hotel suites or quiet restaurants, they resembled corporate board meetings more than mob gatherings. Discussions centered on profits, territories, and strategies, not vendettas. Luciano encouraged bosses from other cities, Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, to adopt the same model. Soon, his influence spread beyond New York, shaping organized crime across the United States. He had created not just a mafia, but a syndicate, a national alliance of criminals bound by profit and process. Yet, for all his rationality, Luciano understood the role of myth. The mafia needed mystique to survive. He allowed the public to believe in the legend of the untouchable gangster, a figure who ruled from the shadows, feared and unseen. He cultivated that image carefully, ensuring that fear did the work of 1,000 soldiers. When rivals stepped out of line, they disappeared quietly, their deaths treated as business decisions, not vengeance. Luciano's violence was surgical, precise, necessary, and invisible. Meanwhile, Meyer Lansky began managing the syndicate's finances like a multinational enterprise. Through offshore accounts, laundering fronts, and shell companies, he made sure that the mob's millions moved through legal channels. Casinos in Havana, racetracks in Florida, and banks in Switzerland became the arteries of the criminal economy. Luciano's organization was no longer confined to the 5 boroughs, it was global. But with success came danger. Power attracts scrutiny, and whispers of Luciano's reach began circulating through law enforcement. Prosecutors, journalists, and reformers started to see the patterns, the sudden disappearances, the shared profits, the rigged contracts. For now, though, Luciano remained untouchable. He had built too many alliances, paid too many people, and covered too many tracks. To the public, he was invisible. To the underworld, he was godlike. In private moments, however, Luciano understood the cost of what he'd created. He knew that his empire, no matter how organized, rested on the silence of men driven by greed. One crack in omerta, one act of betrayal, could bring it all down. Yet he also knew he couldn't go back. He had redefined organized crime, turning it into a mirror of America's own system, profit-driven, pragmatic, and morally hollow. In the late nights at the Waldorf or the back rooms of the Waldorf Astoria barbershop, where he often held meetings under the guise of grooming appointments, Luciano would sit surrounded by his lieutenants, smoke curling above their heads. He didn't need to shout or threaten, a glance from him was enough. The men around him didn't fear death, they feared disappointing him. That was power. Not the gun. Not the money. But control so complete that it made obedience feel like faith. By 1934, Luciano's vision had become reality. The mafia wasn't just surviving, it was thriving, embedded in the fabric of American business. His genius had transformed the chaos of crime into an institution, one that operated with the discipline of a government and the ruthlessness of a machine. But deep down, he knew that no system built on secrecy could last forever. For now, though, the empire ran perfectly. The city was his, the law was blind, and Lucky Luciano was at the height of his reign, the man who made crime make sense. By 1935, Lucky Luciano stood at the very peak of his empire. To the public, he was a ghost, his name whispered in smoke-filled bars, his power unseen yet everywhere. To the underworld, he was the architect of peace, the man who had turned New York's chaos into order. But even empires built on precision can't control human nature. Greed, envy, and ego were always waiting to return. Beneath the surface of Luciano's carefully constructed system, tension began to simmer. Every ally had ambition. Every friendship had an expiration date. And every empire, no matter how stable, begins to rot from within. Luciano's circle of allies was formidable, men who would become legends in their own right. Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld, handled political influence and the flow of money through unions and gambling. Vito Genovese, his ruthless underboss, was the enforcer of loyalty, feared even among killers. Albert Anastasia, cold and efficient, commanded Murder Incorporated, the enforcement wing that carried out sanctioned hits across the country. Meyer Lansky, ever the quiet strategist, controlled the syndicate's finances with mathematical precision. And then there was Bugsy Siegel, charming, unpredictable, and violent, a man who embodied both the glamour and volatility of the new mafia. Together, they were the ruling class of organized crime. But unity built on power is fragile. The early years of the commission brought prosperity, but prosperity bred arrogance. Some bosses began to think they didn't need Luciano's leadership anymore. Genovese, in particular, began dreaming of replacing him. He saw Luciano's attempts to modernize the mafia, his partnerships with Jewish gangsters, his non-traditional methods, as a betrayal of Sicilian pride. Genovese was old world at heart, ambitious to the point of delusion. While Luciano was a tactician, Genovese was a predator. And predators don't share thrones. Their relationship became a study in controlled hostility. Luciano trusted Genovese's competence but never his loyalty. He often said, "Vito thinks too fast for his own good." But for now, Luciano needed him, a man unafraid to get his hands dirty. Genovese handled the darker side of the operation, narcotics, killings, intimidation. Luciano's brilliance was that he let others bear the bloodstains while he stayed clean. But in doing so, he gave ambitious men like Genovese a taste of power they'd one day try to claim for themselves. Meanwhile, Luciano's alliances outside the Italian underworld were growing. Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel expanded the syndicate's reach into the Jewish mobs of New York, linking with figures like Dutch Schultz and Louis Lepke Buckelter. Luciano believed cooperation was the key to domination. Schultz, however, didn't. He was reckless, a bootlegger turned killer who saw himself as untouchable. When Schultz decided to assassinate Thomas E. Dewey, the rising prosecutor who was cracking down on organized crime, Luciano saw danger. Killing a prosecutor would bring national attention, and Luciano's entire empire depended on remaining unseen. He warned Schultz against it. Schultz refused to listen. At the next commission meeting, Luciano made a decision that would define his leadership. He voted for Schultz's execution. It was a test, a moment where the syndicate had to prove that rules were stronger than ego. Murder Incorporated was dispatched to carry out the hit. In October 1935, Dutch Schultz was gunned down in a Newark restaurant. Luciano's authority was solidified not through violence, but through principle. No man, no matter how powerful, could defy the order he had built. The message was clear: the mafia was no longer ruled by individuals, it was ruled by the system. But outside forces were closing in. Law enforcement, emboldened by Schultz's death and Prohibition's end, turned their gaze toward the mafia's new structure. With liquor legalized, the mob's most lucrative business was gone. To maintain their profits, they pivoted into gambling, labor unions, and drugs. The public saw it as a shadow economy, prosecutors saw it as treason against the law. And leading that charge was the young, ambitious Thomas E. Dewey, a man whose name would soon haunt Luciano's empire. Inside the organization, paranoia began to take root. The more the government investigated, the more Luciano tightened control. But the tighter he pulled the strings, the more his lieutenants felt the pressure. Bugsy Siegel's temper grew shorter, Genovese's envy sharper, and Costello's patience thinner. The psychological cracks were forming. Luciano's brilliance was that he could sense those fractures, but even he couldn't stop them all from spreading. There was also the matter of image. Luciano, once a shadow, had become a symbol, and symbols attract attention. The press dubbed him the Lord of the Underworld. He was photographed in expensive suits, dining at the best restaurants, his name whispered alongside politicians and celebrities. It was intoxicating, and dangerous. Visibility was poison in Luciano's world. While he tried to maintain his low profile, others around him flaunted their wealth. The line between criminal and celebrity blurred, and with it, the safety of anonymity. Luciano tried to stabilize things by focusing on national expansion. With Lansky, he began coordinating operations in Chicago with Al Capone's successors, expanding to Miami, New Orleans, and Havana. The dream was a continental syndicate, a seamless network of criminal enterprises operating like multinational corporations. But as his empire expanded, control became diluted. He could manage men, but not their desires. Each family wanted more autonomy, more profits, more influence. And each saw themselves as the rightful heir to Luciano's throne. Vito Genovese made his first move in 1936. He began secretly aligning with Old World traditionalists, spreading whispers that Luciano's partnerships with Jews and non-Italians were an insult to Sicilian honor. Luciano, always aware, played along, pretending not to notice, waiting for the right moment. His philosophy was simple: let ambition expose itself before you crush it. Yet Luciano's real problem wasn't inside the mafia, it was outside it. District Attorney Thomas Dewey had begun assembling a case unlike any before. Instead of going after murders or smuggling, Dewey focused on Luciano's vice empire, the prostitution network. He saw in it a chance to strike not just at a man, but at the entire structure of organized crime. It was a campaign built as much for headlines as for justice. The public wanted a villain, and Dewey found his in Luciano. While Luciano was busy maintaining alliances and watching his rivals, Dewey's agents were quietly flipping his soldiers. Brothel owners, madams, and prostitutes were arrested and pressured into testifying. The silence of Omerta began to crack, not from betrayal among men, but from fear among women who had never sworn the oath. The walls of Luciano's empire were beginning to close in, even as he sat in his Waldorf suite, believing he was untouchable. In those final days of freedom, the air around him felt different. Friends became cautious, conversations shorter, and loyalty more performative. The alliances he had forged out of logic were turning fragile under pressure. The system he'd built to protect him was starting to betray him, not through blood, but through words. The same code of silence that had made him untouchable would soon become the weapon used against him. The empire still glittered, but behind the glow, the storm was gathering. The alliances that once made Luciano powerful were now laced with suspicion. Rivals waited in the shadows, the law was closing in, and somewhere deep inside, even Lucky Luciano must have felt it, the unmistakable hum of fate shifting direction. By 1936, Lucky Luciano's empire stretched from the docks of New York to the casinos of Havana, from labor unions to high-end brothels. The city breathed under his command, every truck, crate, and ledger line moved in rhythm to his silent authority. But beneath that precision, a different kind of war was brewing, one that wouldn't be fought with bullets, but with investigations, politics, and betrayal. It was a hidden war, and it would decide not just Luciano's fate, but the future of organized crime itself. Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey had become a rising star in New York's legal and political circles. Ambitious, tireless, and morally absolute, he made it his mission to bring down the mafia that the city pretended didn't exist. While other prosecutors focused on gang killings and petty extortion, Dewey looked deeper, into the machinery that powered the underworld. He understood that Luciano's empire thrived not on violence, but on economics. So he followed the money. Luciano, meanwhile, believed himself untouchable. The commission was working flawlessly, his lieutenants were loyal, and the police were paid. His operations were clean, no paperwork, no witnesses, no weak links. What he didn't account for was the one part of his empire he considered beneath him: prostitution. To him, it was a side business, a smaller stream of income managed by underlings. To Dewey, it was the key to unlocking the syndicate. In early 1936, Dewey's investigators began raiding brothels across Manhattan. Dozens of madams, pimps, and prostitutes were arrested. For years, they had worked in silence, protected by fear and money. But now, faced with prison, some began to talk. Their testimonies painted a picture of an invisible hand controlling the city's vice trade, a man named Charlie Lucky. Dewey's team traced payments, safe houses, and coded messages, building a case that connected Luciano to a sprawling prostitution network spanning every borough. Inside Luciano's world, paranoia began to spread. The hidden war had begun. Detectives followed his men, tapped phones, and flipped informants. In dark corners, whispers of betrayal replaced loyalty. Luciano responded as he always did, calmly, methodically, with the patience of a chess player who never underestimated his opponent. He met with Costello and Lansky, ensuring the gambling operations remained safe. He ordered Siegel to keep an eye on potential informants. But what he didn't realize was that his downfall was already in motion, not through betrayal, but through exposure. The New York press turned the case into theater. Headlines screamed about Luciano's call girls, the vice czar of Manhattan, and the man behind the Sin Syndicate. The public, hungry for scandal in the wake of the Great Depression, devoured every detail. Dewey was not just building a legal case, he was building a narrative. In that narrative, Luciano became the face of corruption itself. For a man who had built his empire on invisibility, this was the ultimate nightmare. Luciano was arrested in April 1936 while visiting Hot Springs, Arkansas, a town long known as a gangster sanctuary. When police entered his hotel room, he didn't resist. He was calm, almost amused. He had faced assassins, wars, and betrayals, surely a prosecutor couldn't touch him. But as he was extradited back to New York, shackled and surrounded by flashing cameras, the illusion of untouchability began to crack. While he awaited trial, the hidden war escalated. Inside his own organization, fear took root. Some lieutenants fled the country, others went into hiding. Luciano's enemies within the mafia, particularly Vito Genovese, saw opportunity. Genovese began quietly positioning himself to take control of the family, pretending loyalty while plotting succession. The balance of power within the commission began to shift, each boss wondering how much of Luciano's empire would collapse if he fell. Dewey's investigation dug deeper than anyone expected. Wiretaps revealed coded conversations. Brothel ledgers contained initials that prosecutors tied to Luciano's associates. And the witnesses, more than 80 women, testified that Luciano's men collected their earnings, enforced discipline, and punished disobedience. Many of them had never met Luciano personally, but Dewey didn't need direct proof. He needed a narrative the jury could believe, that Luciano was the mastermind behind it all, the corporate boss of sin. As the trial began, the courtroom transformed into a stage. Reporters filled every seat, sketching Luciano's expression as he sat composed, in a tailored suit, flanked by his lawyers. Dewey painted him as a manipulator, not a thug, but a businessman who commodified human weakness. His voice rang with moral clarity, describing the prostitution racket as a slave system of degradation. Every word chipped away at the image Luciano had crafted, the businessman, the strategist, the reformer. In public eyes, he became a monster. Behind bars during the proceedings, Luciano maintained composure. He refused to show fear or anger, confident that money and influence would protect him as they always had. Yet, for the first time, his control was limited. His soldiers couldn't bribe jurors under Dewey's strict watch. His lawyers couldn't buy witnesses. The empire that had thrived in the shadows was now burning under the harsh light of justice. Outside, the hidden war raged on. Costello and Lansky worked feverishly to keep the syndicate stable. Gambling, narcotics, and labor rackets continued, but without Luciano's guiding hand, coordination began to fray. Rival bosses in other cities, particularly in Chicago and Detroit, watched closely. The commission met in secret to discuss contingency plans, unsure whether to defend Luciano or quietly distance themselves. Even loyalty, once sacred, became transactional. Then came the verdict. On June 18, 1936, after weeks of testimony, the jury found Lucky Luciano guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The sentence, 30 to 50 years in prison. The courtroom erupted, reporters scribbled furiously, flashes popped, and Dewey stood triumphant. Luciano didn't flinch. He simply nodded, adjusted his tie, and walked out under guard, his face expressionless. Inside, though, the unthinkable truth had settled in. For the first time, he was not in control. The hidden war had been won, not with bullets, but with paper, ink, and testimony. Dewey's campaign had done what the old dons, the rival gangs, and the assassins never could. It had broken the man who built the modern mafia. But even as he was led away in chains, Luciano understood something Dewey didn't: empires built on ideas don't die with their leaders. His machine, his commission, his code, his structure, would survive. From his prison cell, Luciano would soon begin a new kind of battle, one fought through whispers, influence, and alliances beyond bars. The hidden war had ended, but the game was far from over. Lucky Luciano had lost his freedom, but not his reach. The world outside didn't yet realize that even behind concrete walls, his shadow would still fall across every street in New York. The clang of the cell door at Sing Sing prison echoed like the closing of an era. For the first time since his teenage years, Charles Lucky Luciano was not the man in control. No bodyguards, no lieutenants, no influence to command the world beyond those iron bars. The empire he had built, a machine of wealth, silence, and fear, had been stripped away in a single verdict. To the newspapers, his conviction was justice. To the underworld, it was chaos. And to Luciano himself, it was humiliation disguised as reflection. His trial had been more spectacle than law. Thomas Dewey's prosecution turned morality into theater, transforming Luciano into a symbol of corruption and greed. The evidence was thin, much of it circumstantial, but the narrative was strong. The idea that one man had turned sin into a corporation was too compelling to ignore. The press called him the Vice King of America. The public, hungry for redemption in the midst of Depression-era despair, saw his downfall as proof that no one was above the law. But behind the courtroom drama, another story was unfolding, a story of betrayal, opportunism, and the crumbling of an empire from within. Luciano's sentencing sent shockwaves through the underworld. The commission, once united under his guidance, fractured into quiet factions. Frank Costello stepped in to manage the day-to-day operations, using diplomacy and bribery to keep the peace. Vito Genovese, always lurking in the shadows, saw an opportunity. To the world, he remained loyal to Luciano, vowing to protect his boss's interests. In secret, he began consolidating his own power, aligning with men who were tired of the modern mafia Luciano had built. The hidden war of ambition that Luciano had always kept at bay was now fully alive. In his first weeks behind bars, Luciano's pride was his only armor. He refused to show weakness, even to guards who sneered at him. He read newspapers daily, noting every mention of his name, his empire reduced to headlines and gossip. The other inmates treated him with awe, even criminals recognized hierarchy. But solitude has a way of dissolving illusions. Without the rhythm of business meetings, without the hum of the city, he began to feel the void of control. For a man who had orchestrated the chaos of nations, confinement was worse than death. He began to write letters, some to Lansky and Costello, others to women he trusted. In them, he struck a tone of detachment, as if prison were a temporary inconvenience. But between the lines, there was anger. Not at Dewey, not at the law, but at betrayal. The testimonies that sealed his fate had come from the weakest link in his system, the women who worked for his network. They hadn't taken the oath of omerta, they didn't understand the code. Luciano had built an empire so perfect it only took one piece he didn't account for to bring it down. That irony haunted him. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Dewey became a hero. His name filled headlines, his political career skyrocketed. The people saw him as the moral crusader who had defeated the devil of New York. But Dewey's victory had unintended consequences. By imprisoning Luciano, he had decapitated the only man who could keep the mafia stable. Without Luciano's control, the commission began to unravel into infighting, greed, and blood. Vito Genovese wasted no time asserting dominance. He took over much of Luciano's operations, running the family under the pretense of loyalty. But his methods were brutal, his vision old-fashioned. Where Luciano had ruled through strategy, Genovese ruled through fear. Murders rose, alliances fractured, and corruption became sloppy. Even Costello, who had sworn to uphold Luciano's peace, struggled to contain the chaos. The delicate system of balance Luciano had designed was slowly descending back into the very chaos he had once eliminated. In his cell, Luciano received word of these developments through visitors and coded messages. He didn't rage or panic. Instead, he studied the situation the way he had studied street corners as a boy, mapping the flow of power, waiting for the right moment. Even in prison, he understood that leadership was not about presence, but perception. As long as men feared his name, he still ruled. So he maintained the myth. He gave interviews where he laughed off his conviction, spoke of retirement, and presented himself as a businessman caught in politics. The public saw a fallen king, his soldiers saw a patient one. Still, the psychological weight of confinement grew. Nights in Sing Sing were long and silent, the cold metal echoing the isolation of his thoughts. He replayed the past, the assassinations, the deals, the betrayals, and for the first time, he began to understand the pattern beneath it all. Every victory had come at the cost of trust. Every system he had built relied on fear. And fear, he realized, was not loyalty, it was borrowed time. There were moments when he reflected on what his empire had become. In creating order, he had created dependency. In enforcing silence, he had created blindness. His men had followed him not because they believed in his dream, but because they feared his power. Without him, that fear had no direction. It turned inward, into paranoia, betrayal, and collapse. In a way, Dewey hadn't destroyed the mafia, Luciano had. He had made it too perfect, too centralized, too reliant on his mind to function without him. But even broken, the mafia was still his. Through Costello and Lansky, Luciano managed to maintain influence behind the scenes. Money flowed into his prison account, guards looked the other way, and messages were carried discreetly through visitors and coded letters. Orders were still given, deals still approved. The man who had built a shadow government was now governing from the shadows of a cell. Yet for all his control, one truth gnawed at him, the betrayal of his own creation. The code of omerta, the sacred silence that had protected his empire, had failed. Not because men spoke, but because he had believed silence alone could hold loyalty. In that realization was the seed of his transformation, the beginning of the philosopher within the gangster. By 1937, Genovese's hunger for power led him into reckless decisions, and when a murder charge forced him to flee to Italy, Luciano's position, even from prison, became stronger again. Costello, acting as Luciano's voice on the outside, restored order to the syndicate. For the underworld, the message was clear: Lucky might be behind bars, but he was still the mind behind the mafia. In the stillness of his cell, Luciano learned something his years of power never taught him, the true anatomy of control. It wasn't built on fear, wealth, or even loyalty. It was built on perception. The world still believed in his myth, and that belief kept his empire alive. Dewey might have taken his freedom, but he hadn't taken his legend. And legends, Luciano knew, could outlive their makers. As he lay on his bunk at night, cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling, he might have smiled at the irony, that the man who once ruled New York streets now ruled its silence. For all the bars around him, Luciano was still playing the long game. The fall had begun, yes, but for Lucky Luciano, even falling was part of the plan. The trial of Charles, Lucky Luciano in 1936 was more than a legal proceeding, it was a public crucifixion. It wasn't just the fall of a man, it was the spectacle of dismantling a myth. For years, Luciano had lived above the law, ruling New York's criminal empire with precision and control. But now, the courtroom became his battlefield, and his greatest weapon, silence, could no longer protect him. The courtroom at the New York Supreme Court was packed from the first day. Reporters filled every bench, sketching his every movement. Society women came just to see the infamous Vice King. Policemen stood guard at the doors, as if expecting a rescue attempt from the underworld. Every flashbulb, every whispered word, every stare aimed at Luciano carried the same electric charge, the hunger to watch power fall. Luciano entered the courtroom each morning immaculately dressed, calm, and detached. He didn't rage, he didn't plead. He sat with the poise of a man attending a business meeting. The prosecution tried to paint him as a monster, he countered by behaving like a gentleman. It was psychological warfare, Dewey's moral authority against Luciano's aura of composure. Dewey's voice carried the weight of righteousness as he addressed the jury, "This man has sold the souls of hundreds of women for his fortune. He hides behind money and fear. But the law will not be silenced." The prosecution's case was built on a chain of testimonies, dozens of women who had once worked in brothels now controlled by Luciano's organization. They spoke of beatings, of money collected by Luciano's men, of whispered threats. But few had ever met Luciano personally. There were no documents, no direct witnesses, no physical evidence tying him to the operations. Dewey's genius wasn't proof, it was narrative. He connected the dots through perception, building an image of Luciano as the spider at the center of a web so vast that it didn't need fingerprints to prove guilt. Luciano's defense team, led by the seasoned attorney George Morton Levy, argued that Dewey was conducting a political witch hunt. They insisted the witnesses were coerced, their testimonies bought through promises of immunity. They questioned the lack of tangible evidence. They even tried to portray Luciano as a businessman unfairly targeted for his reputation. But the tide of public opinion was too strong. Newspapers ran front-page stories daily, describing the Luciano vice ring as a plague on morality. Dewey, once a rising prosecutor, was now a national hero. Inside the courtroom, tension was constant. The witnesses, mostly women from impoverished neighborhoods, cried as they described their lives under the mob's control. One described handing over half her earnings every night to men who worked for Lucky. Another recounted how her friend was beaten for refusing to pay. Dewey walked the jury through every sordid detail, using shame and outrage as his weapons. It was emotional theater, and it worked. Luciano remained expressionless, though inside he was seething. He had survived gang wars, betrayals, and assassination attempts, but now, his empire was collapsing under the testimony of people he had never met. It wasn't power or bullets that had brought him down, it was exposure. He realized that for all his discipline and control, his empire had been built on a fragile human foundation, fear. And fear, once broken, spread faster than loyalty. When Dewey finally delivered his closing argument, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Charles Luciano, he declared, is not a man who fires a gun or wields a knife. He doesn't have to. His weapon is control, control over people, over fear, over silence. That's what makes him dangerous. The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgettable. It was a masterstroke. Dewey wasn't convicting Luciano of prostitution, he was convicting him of being what the public feared most, an invisible ruler. The jury deliberated for less than 9 hours. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous, guilty on 62 counts. The judge's voice was steady as he pronounced the sentence, 30 to 50 years in state prison. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Reporters dashed for the phones. Dewey sat still, his expression tight but triumphant. Luciano simply straightened his tie, looked at the jury, and said quietly, "Well, that's that." Outside, the headlines exploded. Lucky falls. King of crime sentenced to half a century. The press devoured every image, Luciano being led away in cuffs, his once slick hair now disheveled, his confident grin replaced by an unreadable stare. For the first time, America had seen the mafia bleed. Dewey became a national celebrity overnight. He would ride this case all the way to the governor's office, and nearly to the presidency. But in the shadows, the trial had unintended consequences. Luciano's imprisonment created a vacuum. The structure he had built, the commission, the code, the alliances, began to shift under new pressures. Rival bosses interpreted his fall not as justice, but as opportunity. The law might have taken down the man, but it had no idea how deeply his system had already embedded itself in America's infrastructure. The unions, the gambling rings, the rackets, they continued, fueled by the same machine he designed. Back in his cell, Luciano reflected on the irony of it all. Dewey believed he had dismantled organized crime, but all he had really done was make it invisible again. With Luciano gone, there would be no single face to target, no central figure to hold accountable. The commission, his true creation, was faceless and eternal. He had built a structure that could survive without him. Still, the fall weighed heavily on him. For the first time, Luciano began to question the morality of what he had built. The testimony of the women haunted him, not because he pitied them, but because they represented a flaw in his system. He had built a world of rules, efficiency, and control, but he had ignored the human cost. His empire, he realized, wasn't built on loyalty or order, it was built on exploitation. For a man who prided himself on intellect, that was the cruelest truth of all. Even behind bars, Luciano's influence lingered. Guards treated him with a strange respect. Fellow inmates sought his approval. Politicians whispered about deals to shorten his sentence. But in his heart, something had changed. The trial had stripped away the illusion of invincibility. For the first time, Lucky Luciano understood that power was never permanent, it only lasted as long as people believed in it. In the quiet of his cell, he lit a cigarette and stared through the bars at the gray sky beyond. "They think it's over," he murmured to a fellow inmate. "But this game doesn't end because one man's in a cage." And in that moment, the man who had built the modern mafia began to plan again, not for escape, but for survival, adaptation, and rebirth. The trial and sentence marked the end of an era, the fall of the first modern crime lord. But history would later reveal that Luciano's imprisonment didn't destroy organized crime, it institutionalized it. The commission, his invisible parliament of crime, would go on to run smoother than ever. The law had won its battle, but the war for control of America's underworld was far from over. The iron bars of Clinton Correctional Facility clanged shut behind Lucky Luciano in the summer of 1936, sealing away the man who had once commanded the American underworld like a general. For most men, a 50-year sentence would have meant oblivion, a slow decay into insignificance. But Luciano wasn't most men. From the moment he stepped into prison, he refused to see it as the end. To him, this was just another phase of control, a new kind of empire to manage, one bound not by city limits, but by walls and whispers. Luciano's arrival at Clinton, a cold, isolated prison near the Canadian border, was met with curiosity and fear. Inmates who had grown up hearing his name whispered in alleyways now found themselves walking past him in the yard. Guards who had read about him in newspapers stared with a mix of suspicion and awe. He carried himself the same way he always had, calm, polite, and untouchable. The same confidence that once filled boardrooms and backrooms now filled cell blocks. Within weeks, he had adapted the same principles that made him powerful on the outside: order, influence, and loyalty. Through small favors and strategic patience, Luciano turned the prison into his new territory. He befriended guards, learned their routines, and subtly made himself useful. Cigarettes, cash, and connections flowed quietly through his cell. He never gave orders directly, he suggested, hinted, implied. By the time his first year ended, other inmates were running errands for him, guards were delivering messages, and the warden's office received mysterious donations from anonymous benefactors connected to Luciano's network outside. Even in confinement, he remained the boss. But behind the stoic control, there was reflection, and for the first time in his life, a degree of introspection. Prison had slowed him down, forced him to confront the machinery of his own creation. From newspapers and coded letters, he followed the underworld's evolution. Frank Costello was now the acting boss, maintaining the peace in Luciano's absence. Meyer Lansky continued to manage the syndicate's finances, ensuring Luciano's family was provided for. But he also saw cracks forming. Vito Genovese, ever ambitious, had returned from Italy, quietly regaining influence and challenging Costello's authority. Luciano watched it all unfold from afar, powerless to intervene directly. Isolation sharpened his mind. For the first time, Luciano began to understand the difference between control and influence. Control was an illusion, it required presence, enforcement, fear. Influence, however, could exist in absence. It was the echo of power, the residue of respect. And Luciano, even from a cell, had plenty of it. Through intermediaries, he communicated with his associates, giving approval on deals, advising on conflicts, and occasionally settling disputes between families. His voice, though physically silenced, still resonated across the commission. The American mafia had never been more unified, ironically, under a man who was behind bars. Luciano's imprisonment, instead of weakening his legend, amplified it. Newspapers referred to him as the imprisoned emperor. His mystique grew. On the streets, men spoke of him as if he were still pulling the strings, an unseen force keeping balance in the underworld. Even the police admitted quietly that crime had become more organized since his incarceration, proof that his system worked. Inside his cell, Luciano kept a daily routine. He exercised every morning, shaved meticulously, and read voraciously, history, psychology, even philosophy. He was fascinated by Machiavelli's The Prince and by the Roman Empire's structure of power. He saw reflections of himself in those pages, the ruler who governed through alliances and fear, who understood that morality was a tool, not a principle. Yet, as he read, another feeling began to emerge, not regret, but fatigue. He began to see how every empire, no matter how perfectly built, eventually turns on itself. Still, his mind remained sharp. He used the prison mail system to send coded letters to his allies, disguised as correspondence with family or lawyers. In these letters, he offered advice on deals and occasionally hinted at decisions regarding leadership within the families. His messages were vague but unmistakable to those who knew his language. The garden must be trimmed occasionally, he wrote once, a cryptic approval for a hit on a troublesome capo. Another letter ended with, "Let the river flow as it has, but build new bridges." To anyone else, it was poetry. To his lieutenants, it was strategy. Despite his enduring power, Luciano also faced moments of vulnerability. Nights were long, filled with silence and memory. He thought often about his youth, the immigrant boy hustling on the Lower East Side, the kid who wanted control because the world had given him none. He wondered if the man he had become was worth it, if the empire he built had really been a creation or simply a reflection of the chaos he had tried to escape. He never confessed remorse, but there was a weariness in his thoughts, an unspoken awareness that no man could win forever. His influence extended beyond crime. Politicians, still wary of his connections, occasionally reached out indirectly. Rumors spread that certain officials consulted his network to maintain order on the docks and in the unions. Some even speculated that Luciano's men continued to assist local authorities in controlling labor unrest, a dark symbiosis between the law and the lawless. In a world still recovering from the depression and inching toward war, the line between criminal and patriot blurred daily. Luciano understood this better than anyone. Then came World War II, and with it, a strange twist of fate. In 1942, a series of fires and explosions erupted on New York's docks, fueling fears of Nazi sabotage. Desperate to protect the harbor, U.S. naval intelligence turned to an unlikely source, the imprisoned Lucky Luciano. Through intermediaries, they approached him with a proposal: help secure the docks using his underworld connections, and in return, consideration would be given toward his sentence. It was an offer born out of necessity, and Luciano, ever the strategist, saw opportunity. He agreed to cooperate, using his influence to ensure the dockworkers' union, many of whom were controlled by his associates, would protect the ports and supply lines. Even behind bars, he managed to orchestrate the operation efficiently, proving that his reach extended beyond iron and stone. The Mafia's cooperation in safeguarding New York's docks was a quiet success, and Luciano's involvement, though secret at the time, planted the seeds of his eventual redemption. As months turned into years, Luciano's legend transformed into something more than criminal myth. It became historical inevitability. The boy from Sicily, the man who turned the Mafia into an empire, was now a figure of paradox, a prisoner commanding an invisible army, a gangster aiding a government, a villain who understood the mechanics of order better than the law itself. And so, as the war raged overseas, the underworld remained remarkably stable. The Commission continued to operate under Costello's leadership, guided by the principles Luciano had created years before. Even the government, unknowingly, benefited from his order. From his narrow cell, Lucky Luciano had achieved what few men ever could: control over a world he could no longer touch. The world would soon change, and with it, the boundaries of power. But for now, within the cold grey walls of Clinton Prison, Lucky Luciano remained what he had always been: calm, calculating, and quietly undefeated. He had lost his freedom, but he had not lost his game. After his wartime cooperation, Lucky Luciano was released in 1946 and deported to Italy, the king exiled from his own empire. In Naples, he lived like a ghost, watching the world he built continue without him. He briefly revived his influence in Havana, uniting global mob bosses, but was forced back under U.S. pressure. Alone in exile, Luciano became a philosopher of power, reflecting on how control without purpose turns hollow. In 1962, while meeting a producer about a film on his life, he collapsed at the Naples airport, dying as the myth he had always orchestrated. Luciano's death ended a man but birthed a legend. His system, the Commission, the five-family structure, the Code of Omerta, became the blueprint of organized crime worldwide. Even law enforcement shaped its strategies around his model. He turned the Mafia into a business and power into an institution. To some, he was a criminal genius; to others, a dark visionary who mirrored capitalism itself. His methods influenced not just gangsters but governments and corporations, proof that his understanding of human nature outlasted morality. Long after his death, his rules remained alive, silent, pragmatic, and immortal. The story of Lucky Luciano closes not with violence or spectacle, but with silence, the kind of silence that carries weight, like smoke drifting over the skyline of New York. His death in Naples in 1962 ended the life of a man, but not the reach of his ideas. For decades afterward, his shadow lingered over the city he once controlled. Every street that hummed with power, every deal made behind closed doors, seemed to echo the logic he left behind: order through structure, control through understanding. Luciano had built more than an empire; he had built a philosophy of power that still breathes beneath the surface of every system that hungers to control chaos. He began as an immigrant boy on the Lower East Side, driven by hunger and humiliation. By the time his story ended, he had evolved into a statesman of crime, calm, strategic, and eerily self-aware. He showed the world that power doesn't belong to the strongest or the loudest, but to those who understand people's fears. He proved that violence was only the language of amateurs, true dominance came from knowing how to make others act willingly. To his enemies, he was a criminal mastermind. To his peers, he was a teacher. To history, he became the embodiment of organized ambition. Decades later, even as the mafia fractured and faded, Luciano's fingerprints remained on every criminal blueprint. The commission, the five-family system, the hierarchy, all continued to function long after his death, a living ghost of his governance. Even law enforcement, in trying to destroy his creation, ended up imitating his structure. The FBI's hierarchies, their intelligence networks, their coded secrecy, all mirrored the organization he designed in the 1930s. He had forced not just criminals, but governments, to evolve. And yet, the final truth of Lucky Luciano's life lies not in his crimes, but in his contradictions. He was a man who worshipped logic but lived in chaos, who demanded loyalty while trusting no one. He mastered control but never found peace. For all his brilliance, he could never escape the machinery he had built. Every empire, even one made of shadows, eventually consumes its maker. In the end, the man who had ruled through silence was left with silence, a kind of poetic justice that even he might have admired. Standing by his grave in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, one feels that silence. The marble stone bears only his name and years, but beneath it lies a life that changed the world in ways few politicians or generals ever could. He redefined the boundaries between law and lawlessness, morality and pragmatism. Luciano's genius wasn't that he broke the system, it was that he understood it perfectly. He saw that every society runs on fear, loyalty, and profit, whether it calls itself government or gangland. He simply made the truth visible. In the end, his story is a reflection of humanity itself, brilliant, ruthless, contradictory. Luciano wasn't just a criminal, he was a mirror held up to civilization's face. The same instincts that made him a king of the underworld are the ones that drive leaders, corporations, and nations. The hunger to rise, to dominate, to impose order on chaos, that is the real legacy he left behind. If he could speak one last time, perhaps his words would be simple, half warning, half wisdom: the game never ends. It only changes players. Because in truth, Luciano's greatest creation wasn't the mafia, it was the timeless design of power itself. The rules he lived by still govern every boardroom, every negotiation, every battlefield. And as the lights of New York shimmer against the dark horizon, one can almost imagine him watching, calm, composed, and victorious, knowing that the empire he built was never really buried.